Thank you for joining us this morning. I know you've been a busy man in Washington and trying to put a package together and straighten it all out. And maybe you can do that for us this morning and outlining exactly what we can expect. So thank you and Merry Christmas to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rudy. And it's great to see you all. Thanks for taking a little time this morning. And Mayor Cabo, welcome. We have not worked together in past, and Danbury is sadly not in my congressional district, but you're right on the border there. So look forward to working with you on issues of mutual interest. Yeah, and so guys, my thought was that I would give you the best I know about what is just a massive bill. I can outline for you three categories of things that you'll get a lot of questions about, some of which you will know already, but the three categories of things I can outline for you are the aid that is targeted at individuals. There's three big buckets of that. The aid that is available for businesses. And then I think of special interest for the COG and for you guys. There's a grab bag of aid that goes to transportation, that goes to K through 12, to universities and colleges, to broadband, to fisheries. I don't want to overly raise expectations. This was a part of as the now famous 5,900 pages. Talk about a way not to do legislation. The good news is a lot of the stuff that's in the bill has been negotiated for many months, so it's not like we were completely ambushed by it. I'm going to stay well clear of the political history of this bill. I'll tell you that there was no doubt in my mind that I had to vote for this thing because, frankly, a relief bill should have been put together probably 4 or 5 months ago and passed, when we could really tell that this thing was coming back and that the economy was not bouncing back. But Washington being Washington, it took till now. There's lots of criticisms you can make of the bill. I happen to think certain of its provisions are too small. Some are not particularly smart, but I'm one of 535 people, so I don't call the shots. But it is going to bring a whole bunch of aid. The theory is, and of course the politics will influence this, but the theory is that 2 months from now we look back and figure out what else needs to be filled in. That, of course, is a nice theory that is going to be very challenging under the likely divided government in Washington. So anyway, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on, the $600 check people are going to get. Half the world thinks that it should be a lot more, including, by the way, the President of the United States. And there are people who believe it should be zero. We compromise, it's 600. Right now, the point is to make sure people really understand what's there for them and how they can get it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the president's statement last night. I have no idea what he's going to do. I'm not sort of surprised that he wanted the spotlight back on the White House, but I'm not going there. I'm going to assume that this is going to get signed because it's pretty important that it gets signed in the face of a expiring unemployment insurance provision and that sort of thing. Okay, so let me just, I'm going to quickly tick through those three categories of things. You will probably have a lot of detailed questions that I won't be able to answer because the mechanisms for the transition of funds and the fine point elements of qualification and whatnot remain to be worked out. The good news is, of course, most of the money is coming through existing programs, so we're not going to need to stand up new programs to deliver it. And then let's talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. I'll try to answer whatever questions you have. Okay, so let's start with people. Aid to people, individuals, comes in three big ways. Number one, unemployment insurance, every one of the programs, traditional unemployment for W-2 workers, the pandemic unemployment assistance, what was known as PUA, that's the new program, or new in the spring, that offered unemployment to sole proprietors, to the self-employed, to gig economy workers. All of those programs are now being extended to full 11 additional weeks. I'm told, for reasons I don't fully understand, that it may go beyond that into April. So people can generally have some confidence that they will continue to receive their weekly unemployment checks through March or April of 2021. In addition to the extension, every one of those programs will see a $300 increment on top of the amount that people were getting. So if you were getting $400 a week, I may have said month, I meant week. If you were getting $400 a week, that number will go up to $700 a week. This, as you all know, is administered through the Connecticut Department of Labor. In contrast to the crazy 3 months after April, where they had to set up new programs and upgrade 1970s software to accommodate the new unemployment insurance. My impression is that that'll all come online relatively quickly. Okay, so that's unemployment. Second bucket of thing for people is what I was just referring to, what you've read about, is the $600 checks. This is going to be just like the $1,200 in the spring, with a couple of minor changes. It is still subject to a $75,000 individual income limit, $150,000 for a couple filing jointly. It is still true that minor dependents will get the $600. So traditional family of four, mom, dad, two kids, family income below $150,000, that family will get a $2,400 check. That's the way it worked in the old plan. Above $75,000 individual income, the check amount is reduced until you reach $99,000 in individual income. Double that for a couple filing jointly to $198,000. At that point, it fades to zero. No, sadly, and this was actually a little bit of a personal fight for me, no dependents who are in college, non-minor dependents, do not qualify. To me, that seemed nuts because, you know, you're making $75,000 a year, you got kids in college, you know, you're not living high on the hog, you're financially strapped. I think it should have gone. Got that question a lot back in the spring, but that's not what's in the legislation. So non-minor dependents will not get checks. The only other change, which matters in some of our communities that are immigrant heavy, is that mixed households. Now, mixed households are a household where you've got a U.S. citizen and a non-U.S. citizen. Mixed households will now be treated differently. Specifically, U.S. citizen members of a mixed household will receive the $600. In the spring, they didn't. So you have dad who's a U.S. citizen, mom who's not. Dad now gets the $600, and this is actually really important, and will get the $1,200 that dad didn't get in the spring payment. Okay, that is the second element of aid to individuals. The third thing I want to highlight, which I think is going to be important, particularly in our lower income communities, there is $25 billion. Oh, and by the way, just so you know, those two programs are just shy of a third of the bill. There is $25 billion in the bill set aside for emergency rental assistance. So the emergency rental assistance program will allow eligible households, defined as households that have income below 80% of the area median income, and who can demonstrate that somebody in the household is economically distressed, is on unemployment, at risk for homelessness. Here's where my understanding gets a little fuzzy because they're going to write the rules on it. But basically 80% AMI and below, with demonstrating that a member of the household is in economic distress because they're at risk of homelessness or unemployment or financial hardship of some definition. Those households will be eligible to have their rent arrears, their utilities, and their utility arrears paid through this program. The money will go from Treasury to the state. The state will then give the money to state and local agencies. And I wish I could tell you who they're going to be, but I can't. I know that under the old program, where the state was doing some of this, organizations like the Urban League and HDF and others were doing it. Right now, I can't tell you who's actually going to be out in the neighborhoods promoting this. Last thing I'll say on this program is that there's two ways to get it that should assist, at the end of the day, the landlords, obviously. Individuals, tenants can apply for it. If they do that, they'll get it. If they qualify, the payment is made to the landlord, not to the tenant. If a landlord, somebody who owns 10 units wants to, the landlord can apply directly for it. They just need to get the consent of the tenants. Again, I don't quite know what that process will look like, but the point is that the landlord, 10 units, 7 aren't paying rent. The landlord can go and say, hey, I'd like to get the rent paid for these tenants. This gets a little fiddly, but any federal mortgage, this is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, any FHFA, any Department of Agriculture, veteran, blah, blah, blah mortgages. There's a whole zoo of them out there. An eviction moratorium is extended through January of 2021. That gets a little messy because people never know exactly who's guaranteeing their mortgage, but I wanted to throw it out there. Oh, by the way, I should have mentioned this. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned this on the before I move on to small businesses. The $600 economic impact payments. The Treasury Secretary said 2 days ago that he anticipated that the IRS could start processing and sending those checks out in a matter of a week to 10 days. It will be based on 2019 income because people obviously haven't filed their 2020 returns yet. And then there will be a true-up process because a lot of people are going to have lower income in 2020, obviously, than they did in 2019. So there will be a true-up process associated with the filing of your 2020 1040, which will make people whole against what they would get based on their 2020 income. Sorry to leave that detail out. Okay, so that's basically what's there, direct for individuals. Let me move on. And then I'll shut up and we can go back to questions. I'll try to answer where I can. Let me move on to businesses. The famous Paycheck Protection Program loans, very, very successful in Connecticut. There were 65,000 extended for billions and billions of dollars of forgivable loans in the spring and summer. That program is being reauthorized with almost a full third of the $900 billion, 284 billion will go to reauthorize and refinance the Paycheck Protection Program. People can apply for a first loan, and you'll recall, I think most of you recall that this is a loan program that you get through your banker. So you go as a small business to your traditional banker, you apply through them. Yes, the SBA and the federal government stand behind it, but it's originated and underwritten by a bank. There will be, by the way, a set aside for $15 billion for credit unions and community banks. In the first go round, the truly small lenders and the truly small businesses sort of got left behind by the bigger businesses that had long established banking relationships with Bank of America and that sort of thing. So there's $15 billion set aside for small community lenders and credit unions. There's additional $15 billion set aside for community development finance institutions, CDFIs. And minority lending institutions. So forgivable loans, a couple more things to say about it. Well-known program, few differences. One, the law will make the forgiveness of small loans almost routine. So loans below $150,000 in size, there's a much streamlined process to get the stamp from the federal government saying your loan has been forgiven. The expenses that would be forgiven inside a loan, they were and remain payroll primarily, rent, utilities, insurance. I don't want to tick through all of them because there's a long list of qualifying expenses. The law now adds any purchases of PPE as a forgivable expense. There were lots of restaurants, et cetera, that bought plexiglass and cleaning agents and that sort of thing. Last thing I'll mention, actually two things. A company, a business that borrowed one PPP loan, spring or summer, can do a second one, what's known as a second draw. That second draw is really targeted at the hardest and smaller businesses. So to qualify for a second PPP loan, a firm has to have 300 or fewer employees and needs to demonstrate a loss year on year, a revenue loss year on year of 25% in one of the quarters of 2020. Second draw loans are also limited to $2 million. You're going to read in the newspaper, it's a big controversy. I don't really want to get into the politics of it, but the PPP loans turn out to be particularly generous because the forgiven principal of the loan, ordinarily if you borrowed money and the loan was forgiven, the IRS would deem that to be income to you. It will not be deemed to be income, so it won't be taxable. And remarkably, but again, this is giving money away. Remarkably, the expenses that the loan paid continue to be tax deductible, even though you didn't pay them. There's a whole long conversation we could have about that, but them's the facts. Okay, so that's, last thing to mention on the PPP, restaurants. There is no specific program in the bill for restaurants, but through this program, restaurants will be able to take out larger loans. So instead of being limited to forgivable payroll at 2.5% monthly, 2.5% monthly payroll, restaurants will be permitted to borrow an amount up to 3.5 times. I'm sorry, I said percent. I meant times. 2.5 times monthly payroll is what normal businesses can borrow. Restaurants can borrow 3.5 times monthly payroll. Plus other expenses. That's not a cap on the loan. That's just a cap on the forgivability of the payroll portion. Okay. Paycheck Protection Program. There's another program that some of you are familiar with, the Emergency Injury Relief Loan. Economic Injury Disaster Loan, EIDLs. EIDLs are basically non-forgivable low-interest loans by the SBA. The nice thing about an EIDL is that it comes with a $10,000 grant attached to it if a business qualifies. So it's not as generous as the PPP, but it does have this $10,000 grant. Under this legislation, those EIDLs are limited to particularly low-income communities. It has to be to businesses which operate in communities where, and I can't tell you exactly where the lines are drawn. I'm sort of assuming that this will be our cities, probably not Ridgefield, probably not New Canaan. Because it's these EIDL loans are limited and grants are limited to communities where the poverty rate is 20% or more, and in which the family income is below 80% of the area metropolitan mean. But anyway, that's a tool in the toolkit for particularly probably valuable in our cities. So PPP, EIDL loans. Last thing I want to mention in the category of businesses, this is important to everybody, but it's going to particularly make Mayor Martin happy because we've had a lot of conversations about this. The legislation contains something called the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant Program. $15 billion of the legislation is set aside for theaters, performance clubs, and museums. Straight out grant program. Let me read you the definition that I have here. And I'm sorry, when you get handed 6,000 pieces of paper, you take some notes, and I'm not a particularly organized note taker, but shuttered venues include live venue operators or promoters, theatrical producers, live performing arts or operators, museum operators, motion picture theater operators, talent representatives. They are looking explicitly to exclude publicly traded entities and movie chains. So Lowe's is not going to be able to take advantage of this, but I think everyone from the Klein to the Aldrich to the Avon, you name it, these smaller entities are going to be able to take advantage of this grant program. And by the way, $2 billion of that $15 billion is set aside for venues with 50 or fewer full-time employees. I think that's most of who we have, museum-wise and performance space-wise in the congressional district. To be eligible, organizations simply need to prove a 25% year-on-year revenue loss. I'm thinking that's going to be relatively easy for a lot of these guys. They need to meet this. There's a series of tests about not being big and national and publicly traded. And I won't get into the weeds there because I actually think most of our performance and museum venues are going to qualify. So grants can be up to $10 million, but they are capped at either 10 million or 45% of 2019 revenues is, I think, the more likely cap for many of our smaller spaces. The grants can be used for payroll, rent, utilities, purchase of PPE, just like what I was talking about on the Paycheck Protection Program, lending program. Here's a really important little fact. For the first 2 weeks, and by the way, this will be administered through the SBA. We're going to be all over this, kind of watching, when they pull the firing gun. So we'll make sure we tell you everything we know about this. But for the initial 14 days when the program is up and running, only venues with 90% revenue losses will be taken in line for the grants. The idea there is to put the really truly challenged performance spaces and museums at the front of the line. So again, that's going to matter in terms of timing, and we'll make sure we let you know what we know about that. It's also a new program, right? There's no continuation of that program from the original CARES Act. Last thing I want to mention, and I promise you I'm coming to the end here. Nobody should be subjected to me for half an hour straight when I haven't had a cup of coffee. The employee retention tax credit, many of the businesses in your towns and cities took advantage of the employee retention tax credit. It's being reauthorized. It is a credit for 50 to 70% of wages. And individual businesses will make the decisions about whether they do the PPP or the EIDL or the employee retention tax credit. But it's out there. It requires a revenue loss, an experienced revenue loss of somewhere between 20 and 50%. But just make a note of that, and businesses will kind of look on the IRS website and determine whether that's of value to them. Okay, that's the second category, aid to businesses. Last thing I want to mention is sort of a grab bag category that'll be important to you, because it'll really affect our towns, our cities, and our states. Famously, the bill does not include direct aid to states and municipalities, which, by the way, again, I'm not going to editorialize here, but to me that's insane. Because this is how you end up firing firefighters and police officers and teachers. But it is what it is. The deal in Washington, just so you know, was that and it was generally partisan. The Republicans generally said we want liability protection for our businesses and universities to reopen. The Democrats said we want state and local, and the deal was if you didn't get one, you didn't get the other. To me, it's madness that we didn't get both. I'm not a lawyer, but it sort of feels to me like there ought to be a deal struck whereby, a business that can show total compliance with best practices gets some kind of liability protection. And damn, we need the state and municipal aid, but it didn't happen. Dick Blumenthal, our senator, was part of the negotiating team around liability protections. I'd like to tell you I understand the ins and outs of that, but as a non-lawyer, I don't. It just infuriates me because it feels like it would have been fair. It would have been nice to get that state and local money. However, we actually are getting some pretty important funds for our municipalities. $82 billion of the bill is for education. 82 billion, that's a ton of money. And it breaks down like this. K through 12 gets the bulk of that. K through 12 gets $54 billion. I don't need to tell you, because you know far better than I do the portions of your budget that are schools. $54 billion through K through 12. The primary distribution mechanism there is Title I. There may be other distribution mechanisms that I'm not aware of right now, but $54 billion for that K through 12. There is a discretionary fund for governors of $4 billion. So Governor Lamont is going to get, I usually in my head, by the way, assume that on programs that are somehow population-based, we get roughly 1% because we've got roughly 1% of the nation's population. So that's the way I do that rough math in my head. But Lamont will get a portion of that $4 billion discretionary fund that will be designed for use in education. Then finally, particularly important for Fairfield, higher education gets $22 billion. That's public and private nonprofit universities. The FEMA Disaster Relief Fund, which some of you took advantage of, gets $2 billion. There is, oh, by the way, this is important too, $10 billion for childcare. This is emergency funds for childcare providers. Again, this will make Mayor Martin particularly happy, but we've obviously got childcare operators in most of our towns and cities. Most of that will be distributed through the Child Care and Development Block Grant Program. They will be grants provided directly to child care providers. There's also a top up for Head Start operators in our towns and cities. Okay, those are the big ones. There's a huge, by the way, for those of you with hospitals, let me find the number. There is a huge part of the bill that is money, $69 billion for healthcare overall. A lot of that is vaccine testing and contact tracing targeted, but a big chunk of it is going to be to try to make our hospitals and our healthcare providers whole. Last thing I'll very quickly mention, and I don't really understand how this is going to work because it's not an area of expertise for me, but there is, I want to say $7 or $8 billion for broadband access. This is obviously important for families in lower income communities that haven't had access to broadband, but there's going to be a lot of availability for funds, both to provide broadband, to pay broadband access bills, and to help with equipment. Let me stop there. You're going to get, as I get, lots of political questions because, of course, nothing can happen without it becoming a controversy these days. The president's video, and I see this on social media and on Fox News, when we passed this COVID relief bill, we stapled it, and I almost don't want to say we because I don't want to take credit for this. It's the way the leadership decided to do it, but we stapled a $900 billion credit relief bill to the federal budget, to the Intelligence Authorization Act, blah, blah, blah. This is why this thing was 5,700 pages or whatever it was. The aid to Nepal, the foreign aid, that's actually in the federal budget. You can have a long argument about whether we should have more or less foreign aid, but it's not in the COVID relief bill. The president said it was, it's not. The COVID relief bill is in fact COVID targeted stuff. You can be angry about the so-called 3 martini lunches if you want to, that's fine. You can be angry, about full deductibility of business expenses. You can be angry about the $600, but the point is, in a time when people are really angry about everything, the COVID bill is the COVID bill. The federal budget, which was passed alongside with it, has the stuff that is in the federal budget that people will make fun of. But anyway, I just wanted to arm you with that because there's this big movement assisted by the president of the United States saying that we should just scrap this thing and start over because we're sending money to Nepal. We're not doing that. Okay, let me stop there. That's all I've got. Happy to answer questions. I don't know if I'll be able to answer questions in great detail, but thank you for taking the time to hear me out on this stuff.
Thank you, Congressman, very much. Very detailed report, a lot of information. As you said, 5,000 pages is tough to get out in a half hour. How do you want to start this, Francis or Mike, in terms of fielding questions? Have people raise their hands? So,
yes, Mike, could you explain how that works again?
Yeah, well, there's only 19 participants and we have nobody calling in. So if folks want to just reach out and ask their questions, I think we can start that way. If it's overwhelming, we can move to the hand raise option.
okay, who would like to go first? Certainly, we have some questions.
I'll just make a quick comment. I just want to thank you for coming and talking to us, Jim, and also about the last thing that you mentioned. I think it's important for all of us to dispel the things that are going around on Facebook and all of that about all of this foreign aid to all of these countries. I've seen these things on social media and they're really ridiculous. And I do have some problems with various aspects of this bill. I really don't have any questions at all, but it's important that that aspect of it is really advertised by all of us that it's not in the bill, all of that stuff. And I thank you for doing that. And very quickly, I also want to Mayor Cavo, recognize you and thank you for joining the COG here and congratulations on becoming a mayor. Thank you.
Question? Congressman, it's Rudy.
Yeah, go ahead, Rudy.
Yeah, what we're recognizing here locally, and we're trying to put an effort together to raise some money to help support the small mom and pop operations, those retail businesses. You mentioned restaurants, but for those that we're concerned are going to make it through this holiday shopping season, do the best they can, and then come January 1st, 15th, or whatever that date may be, close their doors. and pay off the creditors and move on. Is there any money carved out for those situations, those small business operators?
Rudy, are you asking specifically about restaurants?
No, restaurants I get with the PPP, and I'm assuming that'll be available for the small mom and pop retail outlets. The restaurants you were specific to, relative to the PPP and the forgivable loans, et cetera. But I'm talking about the retail portion of our small towns that have had main streets that have existed for years, whether it's Darien, New Canaan, Richfield, Greenwich, all of us, Sherman, all the way around. What is being done for those people specifically?
Yeah, good question. So, and I'm sorry, I thought you were asking about, there was talk early on of trying to do just the way we've done a specific program for those shuttered venues for the theaters and the museums. There was a lot of talk about trying to do a program specifically for restaurants. Restaurants have unique characteristics.
Right.
They often have lower payroll relative to other businesses, higher payroll relative to other businesses and other business expenses. There is no specific restaurant program in the bill. What there is, and I know you didn't ask about restaurants, so I'll come back to answer your question.
Ahead.
What there is that 3.5 times payroll increment for restaurants. Okay, so the particularly small businesses, Rudy, no, there's no, other than the fact that they are at the front of the line for getting a second PPP loan. So in other words, if you have 400 employees, you'd qualify for a second PPP. If you have 400 employees, you qualify for a first PPP loan. You only qualify for a second one if you have 300 employees or less. Now, I know that the bookstore was 7 employees. That's not a terribly meaningful distinction. But I guess there's a couple of mechanisms. Number one, smaller businesses will qualify for that second loan. Number two, there is the set aside for small banks and credit unions, and your 3-person operations tend not to have the big, well-established accounts at Bank of America. They're at Webster Bank or whatever. So our community banks are going to have a very sizable set aside that is designed to ease the accessibility for the smallest of our small businesses. But no, there's nothing specific for a 10-person operation. The other thing, again, you guys are all in politics, so you get asked these questions by upset people. I can't tell you the number of people who have said, I'm only getting $600, and I need to sort of take a deep breath and say, look, family of 4, you're getting $2,400. Somebody who's lost their job gets unemployment. And Rudy, coming back to your point, for those particularly small businesses that have scaled back hours for employees, the unemployment insurance program, let me make sure I get this right, includes what's known as a shared work program. Traditionally on unemployment, you were either unemployed or you weren't. You got a check or you didn't. The shared work program means that somebody can get prorated weekly unemployment insurance based on a reduction in their hours. So you can be working limited hours and get prorated shared work programs. So you cobble something like that together, Rudy, and hopefully it's meaningful aid. But that's a long-winded way of saying, no, there's not a program specifically targeted at the 10, 20, 30-person retail small business.
Yeah, that's one of our major concerns here in the business environment. That small retailer mom and pop that's been in town for the last 30 years are getting to the end. And our concern is that they'll be shutting down in January and changing the face of our communities. But I'll open it up to other people who may want to ask other questions. There's no one?
Well, I'll just
My
jump.
question, sorry,
Go ahead.
my question, I'm representing Greenwich. Fred had a conflict, was going to be about the underemployed, if they too were going to qualify for funds to make up. So Jim, you answered that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I don't know all the ins and outs of that shared work program, but it's there. And I assume it's probably explained on the Connecticut Department of Labor website.
If I could just say, Congressman, no bill is perfect, but this went a long way. Obviously, I'm happy about the arts grant that you talked about that will be coming not just to Stanford, but to Danbury's got a big theory, Ridgefield, although that playhouse, I think I'm going to move that back down into Stanford. But basically, you know, I'm pleased with that side of the progress, even though it's imperfect. But obviously, as I'm sure the rest of the COG here is very disappointed about the state and local funding. I will say this. The state just announced the CARES Act funding for July 1st through December 31st. And I don't know that Francis has had a chance to look at this. I barely had a chance to look at this, but they've done crazy things with the formula, in our opinion. For instance, they're looking at population density. Well, Danbury and some of our neighbors to the north, even though I have some big disagreements about things, that population density should be driving down their reimbursement for COVID aid. I don't, you know, how about looking at the number of cases of coronavirus, or use that as a basis rather than the fact that you have a spread out area. And at the end of the day, you know, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 communities out of the COG that actually are going to get less money from Q2, calendar Q2 through the next 6 months. So the last 9 months are actually getting less money than what they told us we would be getting for the end of Q2. And, you know, in particular, Greenwich got whacked, Stamford got whacked, New Milford got whacked, New Canaan got whacked. And quite frankly, I suspect that some of the other low population density communities didn't get treated well. This really isn't your responsibility, but I had a call with our delegation, or state delegation, just before you know, while the state and local was still in the mix. And I said, hey, listen, figure out how to distribute this to the state. You can make it on population, you can make it on unemployment claims, you can make it on coronavirus cases, you know, do any of those things. And instead they're doing it on population density and that sort of stuff. And I think it's not appropriate, or you won't be able to get it done. But if we should get to a state and local funding, we can't let the states just make up their own formulas all the time. The members of this COG, and the COG hasn't had an opportunity to talk about it. But basically, there's got to be a little bit more direction given. If you're not going to give the money directly to any city that's got less than 250,000 people or less than 500,000 people, then the Connecticut cities are vulnerable to whatever it is. And maybe you go down to cities at 50,000. That's not going to help New Canaan or Darien per se, but we need something more definitive to the state government. And that's my opinion. Having said all that, I've shared it. I don't expect you to be able to do what I just asked, but I'm still going to ask for it. The last thing is, what do you think the chances are that once Biden gets in there, that there will be a state and local tied, presumably with some liability protection?
Yeah. Let me circle quickly back to your observation, David, because I think we have a little bit of good news there. You're right on the overall issue. I set myself on fire in DC and the first CARES Act because there were a bunch of provisions that were made available to cities in excess of 300,000 population, 500,000 population. We don't have those in Connecticut. So that was a big and ugly day for me. There's a little piece of good news there, David, in the healthcare realm. Stanford Hospital, because of a retrade on the guidance that was in, and it's not just Stanford, it's most of our hospitals, because of a retrade on the guidance on how to get HHS aid, they stood to lose $20 or $30 million. In this bill, actually, we rejiggered the formula such that Stanford is getting made whole on that 20 or 30 million. So there's actually some good news there in the healthcare arena. You might check in with Kathy Szilard, but your larger point is exactly right. We are also
just so you know, Congressman, she tells me about her shortfalls. She doesn't tell me about her wins, just like I tell you about our shortfalls. I don't tell you.
Yeah, that reminds me of somebody, David.
Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so but your larger point is right, you know, and I know you guys work really hard on the issue of, we also give up some funding streams which are sort of configured for counties, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation. Okay, Forward-looking. First of all, we've got a little bit of a game going, and it irritates me because president says, I want $2,000. Of course, Nancy Pelosi says, okay, we'll do that. Well, folks, it's not going to happen. And it's fun to watch if you sort of like watching politics, but it's not fun because I've got people calling me, and you're going to have people calling you saying, do I get $2,000 or $600? You're not getting $2,000, right? The president said it. He shouldn't have said it. Nancy Pelosi decided that she's going to on Thursday put a bill on the floor to do 2,000. It ain't happening. And so anyway, when you get questions about whether it's going to be 2,000 or 600, it's going to be 600. And is the president going to veto this bill? He said he would. I don't know. But I just kind of wish. I mean, we're playing with real human lives here, and so I can't give you a perspective on exactly how this plays out. But I can tell you this $2,000 check thing is not real. In terms of the Biden question, David, there's no reason to believe that the $150 billion for state and local aid in exchange for liability protection comes off the table just because Biden is president. Mitch McConnell was comfortable with that. The high probability here, I'm not supposed to say this is, but the high probability outcome here is that Mitch McConnell is running the Senate in January. And so I don't see any reason why that needs to come off the table. I don't know, inside Mitch McConnell's conference, maybe somebody gets really angry and it comes off the table, but it's there. And I'll certainly aggressively support it. Prospects for additional aid beyond that, I think, are relatively dim. President-elect Biden has said he will exercise his full executive authority, and he actually does. The president does have authority on lots of guidance around HHS money and SBA policies. So I do anticipate that after January 20th, the president will be within the strictures of executive authority, be loosening stuff up. The prospect of a deal beyond the state aid for liability protection, I think is pretty dim. I mean, I'm just looking at the last 7 months. I mean, one of my complaints about this bill, and I'm trying not to complain too much about it, is that it should have happened in July or August, not in December. And that happened because there are people in the Congress who believe nothing should happen, and there's people in the Congress who believe a $4 trillion deal is appropriate. So particularly if we have divided government, which again, I think is the highest probability outcome, I think the prospects for another large deal are pretty dim, particularly now that we've got the vaccine out there, and we're going to, in a month or two, start to see a vaccine-driven decline in incidence and bad outcomes.
So not to put words in your mouth, but I will anyway, you're basically telling me the chances of state and local aid within the first quarter of the next calendar year are about 20%, 25%?
Maybe even slightly higher than that.
Okay, we'll go up to 35.
I would ask, so Dick Blumenthal, as I mentioned before, I'm pulling my hair out over this liability protection. I mean, in the world of politics in which we all live, it gets characterized as this is going to allow, on my side of the aisle, this is going to allow corporations to mistreat their workers. No. I had President Nemec of Fairfield University sitting in my office saying, I need this if I'm going to reopen. It's a much more complicated story than you see on the cable news. And it just feels to me like there's a deal to be done there. So I would give it more than 20% probability, but I would direct you to Senator Blumenthal, because again, he was part of the negotiating team on liability protection, and he gets this stuff in a level of detail that I don't. And the other good thing happening, by the way, is again, political framing. Mitch McConnell wasn't super helpful in calling this a blue state bailout, the state and local aid. Well, guess what? Some of the reddest of the red states are firing police officers and firefighters and stuff too. So it's coming to dawn on people that, I haven't seen a number in a month and a half, but we've laid off something like 1.5 million municipal workers. And so it's starting to dawn on people that this is not a partisan problem.
And the other question I have is, and maybe you covered this, but you covered so many things, I've always lost track. Funding for Metro North / Amtrak in this bill.
I'm glad you asked the question. You're right. I should have covered that. Yes, I meant to. Thank you for reminding me. $18 billion. The bill includes $45 billion in transportation funding for transit agencies, airlines and airline contractors, state transportation agencies, airports, Amtrak, et cetera. I think for purposes of this call, there's a whole bunch of money that's going to CONDOT. I can't tell you exactly how much, but the CONDOT will get money. Greater Bridgeport Transit and all of the transit operators will get money. A big chunk of that, by the way, of the 45, about a third of it is for the airlines to pay their payroll. So the actual money is available for Amtrak, transit agencies, et cetera, is going to be about $30 billion.
One very quick question so I can explain this to Sherman constituents who've asked me this. By constituents, I mean my wife. And a few other people, but if you're 15, if your child is 16 years old, you get a check. Yes?
Yes.
If your child is 17 years old, you don't get a check.
No, 17 you do.
Jim, actually 17 you don't.
Oh, you don't?
It's under 17.
Oh, I thought it was 17 and under.
No, it's the child care
Okay.
tax credit threshold.
That voice of God is my
The reason I ask is
Mark Snyder weighing in. So what Don said is correct.
Correct.
Okay, sorry about that, Don.
no, well, I wasn't sure if it was correct, but because it is worded in the media in different ways, so there is confusion, and people have actually asked me about this. And at 17, your 17-year-old child, you would not get a check. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank
you. As you can tell, there was confusion right here. I'm glad I make stupid mistakes with towns that aren't in my congressional district.
That's perfectly fine. It's nice to have you here.
Mike, do we have anyone else with questions?
I'd go back to Rudy. Could I go back to Rudy's question about the small business people? So Rudy, if you have shop owners that decide to close up as sole proprietors or as self-employed people, they're eligible for unemployment as well as all their employees.
Correct.
So that's probably the relief that those.
Correct.
Folks, but it's only 11 weeks into.
I would rather not see them close up.
Right, but
right. Is there any incentive, any dollars available for them to be incentivized to continue on and to get up and out of this hole that everyone's in?
Do you mind if I weigh in on this quickly?
Yeah, no, please do, Mark.
So first, Selectman Marconi. So Jim talked about one side of this, which is there's a set aside on the lender side to make sure that the lenders who deal directly with these smaller owners, so not the big corporations who deal with the big four banks,
Right.
but if they're dealing with our smaller regionals, there's also which is new in this bill, there's a business side set aside. So there's $35 billion of that 28.5 roughly billion that's set aside for smaller first-time borrowers. So it's borrowers with 10 or fewer employees, and it's also loans to borrowers with the loan is less than $250,000, and they're in low-income areas. So, Stamford, parts of Norwalk, parts of Bridgeport. So there is kind of that carve out for the really small and the smaller loans in those lower income communities. So I think that gets to the point that you're the mom and pops that you're looking for.
Yeah, it does. But the one caveat you mentioned was the lower income communities.
Yeah, it's either or. So it's 10 people. It's 10 people anywhere, or it's loans of less than $250,000 to businesses in low income communities.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate that, Mark. Is there anyone else that has questions?
I have a comment, Rudy. It's Kevin. As far as FEMA, our experience with FEMA on the reimbursement was kind of miserable. And now you've got a new grant program that SBA is going to be, actually that's FEMA versus SBA. But I just wanted to make a comment about, as Rudy predicted back in the springtime, dealing with FEMA was miserable. Jim, I wanted you to be aware of that. I mean, for some reason, they nickel and dime you to death, and it's just that.
They did. We noticed a real change in cooperation relative to, for example, Irene, Alfred, Sandy. And this go around, it was tough getting a nickel out of them, getting approvals. And I wonder if the fact that the state of Connecticut announced that whatever FEMA did not reimburse, the state would step in under the CARES Act and reimburse the municipalities, whether in fact that had an impact on FEMA's position relative to reimbursing the communities. I don't know.
Yeah, Kevin, I appreciate the comment. We've noticed that in my office too. We had a very constructive relationship with FEMA when we had the various hurricane disasters. We've had a less constructive relationship under these circumstances. We spent a lot of time pounding on.
I'm not blaming FEMA so much as I'm blaming the governor, because, you know, having shunted us off to FEMA, because Massachusetts, I understand, got their money in April and immediately gave some of it to state and local governments. You know, we had to jump through these hoops with FEMA, which was, you know, not very productive. But anyway, it is what it is.
Jamie?
Yes, Congressman Himes, thank you very much for being here today. And I am going to pray that the president approves this funding. We really need it here. I want to bring up, it's more of a comment, and I'd like to hear from my colleagues too, if you're seeing the same thing. We have some commercial developments here that are owned and operated by real estate investment trusts. And as a landlord, those trusts are really unwilling to work with their small mom and pop tenants. And we've had a number of businesses go out of business in the last 2 months because the trusts are beholden to their investors. I think everybody knows that story. So I just raise that as another concern that while there seems to be some money available for those landlords, it's really not getting to where it needs to go. And it's a problem that I don't really have an answer for, but wanted to articulate it today.
Good point.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. That's right. I have heard that. Let me invite Mark. I don't have an answer there, but Mark, who's a little bit more steeped in the details. Mark, do we have a perspective on that?
No, and I think especially for these kind of REIT-owned commercial-backed mortgages, I think the problem there is they don't necessarily touch the system. So the way that we've got to deal with those is the trickle-up method, which is your mom and pops get a PPP loan so they're able to keep paying, and that's how we're able to deal with it. But there's, you know, unlike the rental for the non-commercial renters from mom and pop renters, there's no real commercial-backed facility that exists. But yes, this has been a point of lots of conversation over the last couple months.
Congressman Matt Knickerbocker from Bethel here. I've got to log off for a staff meeting, so just wanted to thank you so much for your information. This has been terrific. Got a lot of notes, so thanks so much, and happy holidays to you and your family.
Thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions for the Congressman?
Yes, Rudy, I have one question. Thank you, Congressman. We did observe that the bill has several strong provisions for expanding broadband access, but it appears that there are thresholds that Connecticut would not meet for accessing these funds. Am I mistaken in that?
So the $7 billion in broadband access, most of it or half of it is Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is an FCC program, which my understanding, I'm going to invite Mark to clean up if I make a mistake here, but my understanding is that these are eligible households by household income, which allow for actual retail discounts, $50 up to $75 on broadband service, I guess set $50 on non-tribal land to pay internet service. Mark, do I have that right? Is it income related, or does the state need to qualify?
I would have to get back.
Yeah,
I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Yeah, good question. Let's let us come back to you on that. I candidly, I only in the broadest terms do I understand the broadband access piece of this.
I'd sort of like to double down on what Rudy said. You know, temporary assistance for emergency access to broadband is critically important. But that's really just the beginning of the story. We need a full-blown plan to expand broadband permanently within the state of Connecticut. I think we're all acknowledging we're living in a new world with work and education. So while we appreciate the short-term emergency assistance, I think we're looking for sort of a bigger broadband infrastructure plan at the federal level.
Right. And we've experienced in Fairfield County, at least, that the private and the telecom, we're basically the telecom capital here in Connecticut. But their willingness to go outside of the high density areas is a problem, and it doesn't fit into their financial models. And we've seen some expansion of the availability of infrastructure, but we're also from a municipality level beginning to, if you will, take the bull by the horns and start saying, hey, we've got to do something here, because in remote areas, rural areas, and suburban areas, there's not really much of an effort outside of 5G, and 5G is limited. I know they're all making a big deal out of it. All of their promotional on TV is buy this phone, it has 5G service, but if you don't have 5G in your area, that phone isn't going to do you any good. And when we look to the horizon, there's not a whole lot other than a lot of talk taking place. And we need to move quickly with this, because the mass exodus out of the city, where people are looking to work more remotely, which will help our transportation issues maybe a little bit, as well as the educational side of it, is critical. And I get complaints every day, and I'm sure my colleagues do as well, as the availability of the broadband, the infrastructure itself, there's just not that availability, and we need to address it now, not with a 5-year or 10-year plan.
Jim, I'd like to weigh in on this too, because New Canaan has experienced the same thing. And you know, I know Mark Boughton was trying to do something in Danbury with expanding internet access. And this is an area where we really have to focus on improving. I learned yesterday that Frontier, which is a company coming out of bankruptcy, is investing in New Haven County with their FiOS system, bringing it to the home. I don't know why we can't get Frontier with the UVerse here, which is fiber, and Altice with their fiber we have to figure this out. You know, with kids with remote learning and with everybody working from home, internet is a huge issue for all of us. Quality internet service.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate the points. I saw this very personally in a way that I'm sure some of you did too. I was at an elementary school in Stamford a couple of months ago asking about the distance learning, and you know, you have in particular lower income or elderly households in the case of healthcare that aren't hooked up. And then when the state of Connecticut does the nice thing of actually getting a Chromebook to that household, you still don't have the broadband. And then you've got, you know, a single mom with 3 kids, which kid uses it? It's a heck of a problem. I don't have a good answer for you guys, other than to say, boy, in a community where Charter is headquartered, and you know, we ought to be able to get this right. It will probably be driven at the state level, so I'd encourage you to push hard on your state reps and state senators. But I want to help.
Jim, actually, that's the problem, because they're saying, you know, internet's exempt, and the feds have exempted it from state regulation and stuff. So, you know, Hartford kind of says we can't do anything because it's a federal exemption.
Okay. All right. I'll learn some more on that. I'll learn some more. It's not an area in which I'm real expert.
Well, the reality is, though, that, you know, people with either Optimum, Altice, you're doing telephone service over the internet, and the internet is exempt. So both telephone and internet, what people are, you know, getting away from hard lines, it really requires a rethinking of what the local regulation should be to assure that people get quality service, especially during storms and stuff. I mean, that was our experience in August was horrible with telecom.
Yeah.
I would agree with that, and it's probably the first time you're going to hear a Republican say that we might want to expand regulation on telecom services, but I think we're at that point.
Right. We need to have the availability of fiber, and the private telecom companies are using it to provide their 5G, but outside of that, we do not have accessibility. In Connecticut, we have something called municipal gain, that is an asset that carries a value that we could bring to the table for a 3P arrangement. And it's difficult getting that to move forward from a single municipality. We need to move forward as a county, as a COG, as a larger group to exert pressure on Hartford to help release some funds that will assist us. We're willing to put in some money into the game. We're willing to belly up to the table because this is a need that we find is critical to the future of all of our communities. If we're going to sustain Fairfield County into the future and be the attractive location to live, work, and play.
Jim, you could help us. You know, Tom Rutledge is the CEO of Charter, and he lives in Greenwich now. He used to live in New Canaan. He used to be COO of Optimum for like 10 years. He knows what the solution is here. But he's focusing on the rest of the country because Charter doesn't operate here. He's got great systems out in the rest of and probably providing excellent internet service to their customers. For some reason, Optimum Altice has become a horrible service for us. And Tom Rutledge could probably explain that to us. I was going to try to talk to him myself, but he's now in Greenwich. You might learn a lot by calling Tom Rutledge and say, what's the problem for Fairfield County with internet service?
Lauren, you put your hand up.
And I need to drop, we have our Board of Selectmen meeting,
I know
but thank
Tom.
you.
I'm sorry, Lauren. I was just acknowledging Kevin. I know Tom, and he's been very constructive, and I think very enlightened in the way he's managed his company during this thing. So I'll reach out to him.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Lauren.
Lauren had to jump off. She has a Board of Selectmen meeting.
Okay. Yeah, I actually probably, Rudy, need to jump off in a minute or two. I've got a group of faith leaders teed up next for similar.
Well, thank you for your time. Is there any last question from anyone? Kevin again?
Thank you, Congressman. Great to have you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you
All right.
very much.
Have a great holiday. My best to your family, loved ones. I know it may be lonely, but enjoy it.
Thank you, everybody. And please, if you hit obstacles or something's not working the way it should be, please do call me. We'll raise some hell.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
I'm sure everyone.
Everybody.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.